to part 1 of a 2-part tutorial that describes the brush pane in Pena. The second part of this tutorial will describe advanced features of using the brush pane. In this tutorial, we will concentrate on basic features of how to use the brush pane and what the controls do. The brush pane is this icon on the control pane in Pena. Tapping it will open the brush pane. Tapping it again will close the brush pane. You can also tap any other pane to close the brush pane, or tap on the move arrows to close the brush pane. The brush pane controls your paintbrush shape and size. When we open the brush pane, we will see 3 major areas. Your current brush shape and size is here on the left. In the middle are icons that control the brush, and on the right we have the ability to load and save favorite brushes. Pena only offers 4 brush shapes: a circular brush, a square brush, an oval brush, and a rectangular brush. These may seem like very few shapes for an advanced paint package, but as you'll see through other tutorials, these shapes can be modified by the effects you place on them. To change the brush shape, simply select the desired brush icon, and it will change to that shape for you. To adjust the size, tap, hold, and drag in the size window. You'll see that below the size window, there is an indication as to how big that brush is. You can actually drag and make the brush very large, bigger than a brush window. In fact, you can make it larger than the canvas itself. It's very useful for painting very, very big effects. Besides changing the brush size by holding and dragging, you can also use the keyboard to change the size. And you'll see that in the case of the circular and the square brush, there is only one value, and this is affecting both the height and the width. In the case of the oval and the rectangular brush, there are 2 values. The first is the width, and the second is the height. Again, these can be independently controlled just by dragging or by using the keyboard. When you paint, the currently selected brush is what you will be painting with. Here we've actually loaded the 4-color gradient effect, and so that's what we're painting with. We'll switch to a circular brush. Let's make it a bigger brush. And we can go to a rectangular brush, make it very thin and big. So this is affecting your basic brush shape. Below the 4 brush shapes, we have some controls that allow us to modify the brush. The first control is the rotate and offset control. Tapping that allows us to set an angle for our brush and an increment. The angle will be a rotation angle that's applied to the brush, and the increment will change that rotation angle as we paint. We can also turn on an offset brush. The offset brush allows the paint to be offset from where our finger is. This can be useful if the brush is very tiny and you want to be able to see where you're painting as opposed to having it obscured by your finger. But this is also useful for making twisting brushes and have brushes that have multiple brushes simultaneously. Again, we can offset it by an amount in the X and an amount in the Y, and we can step the offset such that it offsets more or less over time. Below the rotate and offset icon, we have the taper icon. The taper icon allows you to taper the brush. That means to change its size as you paint. You can make the brush become smaller, or you can make the brush become bigger. This is the final, the taper to X size and the taper to Y size. This is the final size that the brush will reach. And the X step and the Y step is how much to change that size over time. So if we start with a large brush, this is simply saying at the end of painting we want it to be a 1x1 brush, and we want the size of that brush to decrement by 1 each paint step. And all of this can be controlled. These 2 icons over here are not directly related to painting, but are useful in setting up your paint. This particular icon is the texture fit icon. And if we have a texture loaded, for example, we do have a texture loaded. We have our Arches National Park photo loaded. If we want our brush to exactly match that texture size, we would say fit brush to texture, and that brush is now very large, 4,628 by 3,456, allowing us to paint a huge area. Let's turn on our texture so we can see that again. So that's a very, very, very large brush. Going back into the brush menu, let's go back to a more reasonable sized brush and back to our 4-color gradient. Let's experiment a little bit with the rotating brush. Let's make ourselves a bigger brush and see what happens when we paint. We'll paint a dot there and a dot here, and you'll see that those are virtually identical. Now we'll turn on rotate. Let's set our angle to 0. And let's set, I'm sorry, that was the angle increment to 0, so we don't want it to change over time. We'll set the brush angle to 45 degrees. Now as we paint, you can see that the brush is actually 45 degrees rotated from where the originals were. Let's go ahead and add an auto increment to that. Let's say that we want that 45 degree angle brush to increment 4 degrees with every stroke that we paint. In this case, as we paint, you can see that the brush is actually rotating with every single stroke. Let's now add an offset to this. I'm going to go ahead and turn offset on. Let's go to a smaller brush. Clear our screen. And start painting. My cursor is here, but you can see that the paint is not deposited there, it's deposited elsewhere. Because we're rotating, it is now rotating not only the brush, but around our offset. This allows us to do twisting brushes and brushes that have hair-like components or vine-like components, trees, leaves, all sorts of effects are possible with that. You can also get some very interesting effects if your angle increment happens to be a divisor of 360 degrees. For example, we could say that we are 90-degree increments. As we draw, we'll get 4 brushes because there are 4 90 degrees in 360. So our brush is being rotated at 90-degree increments, and that allows us to actually create 4 brushes simultaneously. You could go down to 45 degrees and have 8 brushes, or you could go up to 180 degrees, 270 degrees, any number of degrees to allow that to happen. Let's take a look now at tapering. We'll set ourselves a larger brush, clear our screen, and see what it's like to paint. Okay, we have a non-rotating brush. We'll go into taper. Tell it to use the taper brush. It's going to taper the brush down to 1 by 1, and it's going to do it slowly, just one size at a time. As we paint, you can see that our brush is now getting smaller until it is 1 pixel in size, in which case it'll stay that size until we stop painting. When we start to paint again, the taper is reset, and again we can paint with that taper effect. The taper can actually be opposite. We can go, if we want, and say it's going to taper positively. If it tapers positively, it's going to grow, in which case it'll never get to 1 by 1. It's only going to get bigger. And this allows us to do painting where the brush continuously gets larger and larger and larger until it literally fills the entire screen, or we stop painting. To easily reset these values, these dim circles on the left of the options panes allows us to go back to what the default is. The default is shown right below each of these. So that's a very, very quick way to having to avoid dialing in the number or typing in the number that you want. Again, we're tapering, but now we're again tapering low. Let's clear our screen and discuss a couple other topics here. First of all, this depth icon. It's a scuba diver, and that is to indicate depth. You'll notice that when we paint, we're painting on top. In other words, new paint is appearing on top of old paint. If we turn on the depth icon, that action is reversed. Now as we paint, new paint goes below old paint. Again, depth turned off, paint goes on top of new paint. Depth turned on, paint goes below new paint. If we paint over something we've painted previously after having lifted our finger, it goes on top of that. See, I lift my finger, and again, we're now painting on top of everything, but the paint is actually flowing below what we're painting in this stroke. Around the brush icon, we actually have 3 ways that we can do our painting. Let's clear our screen. The first is the dot mode, the second is line mode, and the third is curve mode. I'm using the simulator to show you this. This allows us to see the cursor as we paint, and the simulator runs slowly as opposed to your actual iPad, where this is about 10 times faster. So this is a good place to show what the difference between these 3 modes are. Let's go in, and I'm going to go ahead and turn on our rotate, and let's set a small increment, and I'm going to turn on taper. Taper is already on, and we can know that taper's on because the icons are highlighted saying something is on in these areas. And we'll go here and paint in dot mode. In dot mode, each time the finger is sensed, the brush is placed at that position. This is one of the fastest ways to paint because there's fewer brush strokes hit. It's only where your finger is sensed that the brush is laid down. If you have a very slow effect that takes a lot of time to paint, you'll want to use dot mode to do that painting. Line mode is the same as dot mode, except between each of the places the finger is sensed, we paint a line. In other words, we connect one dot with the other dot with a line. And you can see here that our taper brush is on, that we can use this, and it's a very, very smooth painting. Let's turn taper brush off a second. And again, we can do a longer stroke. And you can see how there's no longer individual dots, it's a continuous line. And again, this is slow because we're showing you this on a simulator, but it helps to show exactly how that works. Curve is the same as line, except it's smoother. The points of your finger are actually connected together with a curve, and this is very slow in painting. Again, this is the simulator. It's much, much faster on the iPad, nearly instantaneous. But this is a very, very smooth way of painting. Let's bring our brush size down a little bit, just to make it faster in the simulator. So this is the slowest way because very, very many points are being painted. Now you'll notice that the line and the curve have a little blue-green dot in the upper left-hand corner. This means that a second tap to that icon will allow you to change something. We tap it again, and we get the ability to modify the density of the curve. We can take the density down or up. And let's bring it up quite a bit. That changes how many points are drawn in between our finger senses. Here again we can see our curve drawing much quicker with much fewer points. Same thing with the line. Tap to engage it, tap it a second time to modify the line density. And you can always reset your densities to their default value just by clicking the little tiny dim dot on the left hand corner. And that is the basics on how to use the brush pane. The next tutorial will show you advanced techniques in using the brush pane and some advanced techniques in how you work effects into the brush pane.